He was the director of UM's Bird Ecology Lab and has very broad interests in ecology, evolution, and conservation. And he'll be telling us about his experiences in the Pribilofs this past summer. So thanks so much, Eric, for coming here tonight.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back and talk to you. And is Bo still on? Bo? Yeah, the reason that I actually went up to the Pribilofs this last summer was to study Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches, among other things. So I'll tell you more about Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches up there. And unlike here, it turns out they're incredibly easy to study up there. So this is just meant to be a fun, informal talk. So if you have any questions as we go along, just shout them out and there'll be time at the end, I'm sure. So I titled this Pribilofs, the Galapagos of the North. They've often been called the Galapagos of the North. And I actually dropped, so how many of you know where the Pribilofs are? And Joe and Lana, I know you've been there. Yeah. Anybody else been to the Pribilofs? Oh, what were you doing there?
Art o'clock.
Oh. What's that? Yeah. Anybody else been to the Pribilofs? Okay. Let me tell you a story. I got in April, just before I retired, I got a message from a friend of mine, Bruce Lyon, and we grew up together in Quebec. We were friends since we were 7. We got our first binoculars together, and our lives have sort of gone like this, back and forth. He's now a professor of biology at UC Santa Cruz, and he phoned me up and said, how would you like to go on an all expenses paid research expedition to the Pribilof Islands to study birds and climate change? I was like, let me think about it. Yes. And then my second question was, where the hell are the Pribilofs? I kind of knew, but I had to check it out. So here's Alaska, and then here's the Aleutian Islands, and they go way, way over. The Aleutians are as long as the continental United States are wide. So this is really, really far. And if you go about a third of the way out the Aleutians and then north into the Bering Sea, there's a couple tiny little islands up there, and those are the Pribilofs. It's one of the harder places to get to on Earth by plane. It took us over 10 days from Anchorage, flying out to a little native village, refueling, and then flying 2 hours out over the open ocean and looking down at fog banks. And the pilot would circle around for an hour looking for a hole in the fog and say, nope, we're not landing today. So we go back, and it took us about 10 days to get out there. I'm just going to do a little bit of a comparison with the Galapagos because the two sets of islands have often been compared. And I actually dropped out of high school and never finished high school. But when I was offered a job to work for a year in the Galápagos Islands on Darwin's finches. So I spent a year in the Galapagos. So these belong to Ecuador. They're about 800 miles out along the equator out in the Pacific Ocean. They are volcanic in origin. So they're just volcanoes popping up and then eroding back into the sea. And they've never been connected to the mainland. So everything that's there has had to swim or float or fly over. And that's why there's been such amazing, weird things happening out in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so here's just a few pictures when I was in the Galapagos. You can see it's kind of like Hawaii is now, very active volcanoes. Here was home for a while in the Galapagos. You can see the cinder cones and all the lava flows. And they are really desert islands in the lowlands on the tropics. This is me in my Lord of the Flies days. I've been living on islands, small islands, and the food we had was just sort of like Ecuadorian canned spam, which gets old very quickly. So we got to an island that had feral pigs that had been let go hundreds of years ago by sailors and sealers, and they're wreaking havoc on the tortoises and other things there. And so we're encouraged to reduce the population. And we were so starved for food that we didn't really sweat the cooking of this thing. And so this pig got me back. I got every known parasite of pigs. Yeah. But we were there to study the Darwin's finches that have, you all know the story, they've radiated different beak shapes and sizes to make use of different feeding niches. All right, now this is interesting. This will be an interesting comparison with the Pribilofs. This is a satellite photo from space looking down at the Galapagos Islands, and all this greenish yellow color, this is basically chlorophyll. This is greenish light reflecting back into space. So these are chlorophyll blooms from single-celled marine photosynthetic organisms. And it just gives you, there's massive upwelling here, so highly productive oceans here. These are the plants, this is the base of the food chain, so lots of fish, and hence lots and lots of very rich marine life in the Galapagos. So blue-footed boobies, red-footed boobies, masked boobies. And here's a site that you'll often see in these very highly productive marine environments where you get swarms of fish, or as David Attenborough calls them, bait balls, coming to the surface that are driven up by larger predatory fish. So these poor little fish are caught between the big tuna and stuff underneath, and then just these boobies raining down from the sky, catching the fish. Okay, you'll see similar things up in the Pribilofs. So this is just evidence of this highly productive marine system. Albatrosses, waved albatrosses, and other things. It's got the northernmost penguins in the world. These are Galapagos penguins. So these, of course, dive underwater, and their foraging niche is fish deep underwater. And we'll compare these to the auks up on the Pribilof Islands. This is a southern fur seal, and so there's lots of fur seals in the Galapagos. And again, these are very cold water species because there's very cold Humboldt current that comes up here. All right, so a comparison with the Pribilof Islands going way farther north. So they're about 300 miles west of Alaska, out in the Bering Sea. They are similarly volcanic in origin, as you'll see, but the major difference with the Galapagos Islands, even though they're volcanic in origin and way out in the middle of the ocean now, they were recently connected to the mainland, as I'll show you. They were part of the Bering land bridge that connected Siberia to North America. So up until, so fairly recently, about 10,000 years ago, Pribilofs were connected to the mainland. And this will have lots of important sort of ecological and evolutionary consequences. All right, so here's a picture on the Pribilofs, and you can see cinder cones and volcanic lakes. And the islands are completely basaltic. Okay, so it's all lava of various sorts. It looks kind of gray and dingy now. Oh, so there's two main islands that make up the Pribilofs, St. Paul, and just to the south, St. George, and then a couple others, much smaller ones. But St. Paul Island, these are very tiny islands. This island is about 12 miles long and about 6 miles wide. This is the airstrip. So this is about as long as the Kalispell runway. And you can see it's about a third of the island. So it gives you an idea of how small the islands really are. There's one town, it's down here, St. Paul, on this harbor and tidal estuary right here. So there's an Aleut community here, the community of St. Paul. And so this is my friend Bruce Lyon, and so it was just the two of us up there, and this was what I'm going to tell you about. We spent 2 months there. This was a preliminary study to see if we could study Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches here. We didn't really know, but as you'll see, the answer is a resounding yes. It's one of the best places in the world to study Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches. Bruce is an amazing photographer, so some of the photos you'll see tonight are taken by my friend Bruce. And that's St. George Island in the back, about 20 miles away. All right, as you drive into the native village of St. Paul, you see this sign. It's the home of the world's largest northern fur seal breeding rookery. There's about 1.5 million northern fur seals that haul out on the beaches and breed there. And even for such, this is remarkable for birders. You know, I don't think there's probably many other islands that are this small in the world that are such biodiversity hotspots, okay? It has on the sign 203 species of birds been recorded there. It's way higher than that now. And here's a similar satellite photo from space. So here is St. Paul's Island, and here's St. George's. And the currents are coming from the south. You can see these eddies and swirls. This is all chlorophyll, light bouncing off chlorophyll. So this is all single-celled photosynthetic things that are living in the ocean. So highly, again, this is the base of the food chain. So this is incredibly highly productive marine environment. So amazing fisheries around here, one of the best halibut fisheries in the world out of here. And also it supports lots and lots of fish, and hence lots and lots of fur seals and seabirds. It's really interesting. The biology that I'm going to spend most of the time on was just mind-blowing for me. I spent a lot of time in the Arctic and other places studying birds all over the world. So the biology was just mind-boggling to me. But I've got to say, one of the most special aspects for me about this trip was living for 2 months in this Aleut community. I didn't really know what to expect. And let me just give you a little bit of history, because it's pretty remarkable. There were no native people living on the Pribilofs until about 300 years ago. The reason is just they're so remote, so far out there, so small. But the Russians began harvesting fur seals for the pelts, for making coats and so forth. And so Pribilof was a Russian captain who discovered the Pribilofs. And so what the Russians did, the Russian fur sealers did, is they went down to the Aleutian Islands and they grabbed a whole bunch of native folks, Aleutians, made them slaves, brought them up and dropped them off on the Pribilofs, and held them as slaves for about 300 years. And their job was to kill northern fur seals for the Russians. And then, so in Seward's Folly, when Russia sold all of Alaska, including the Aleutians and the Pribilofs, to the United States, the Pribilofs came along with that. And so then the folks were, since about 1878 till 1984, about the only job was killing fur seals for the US government. And so in 1984, Greenpeace folks went up and protested and made a big stink. And so the US government just stopped the fur seal harvest, which was about the only job in town. And it economically pulled the rug out from under the folks there. But they're very tough people. They've survived and diversified and are still out there. Anyway, these folks, so very, very interesting history. Here's a northern fur seal bull. This is bigger than I am. They're really big and kind of scary. So the males fight for sections of these breeding beaches and then have harems of females. This is a picture taken about the turn of the century, about 1920 or so. And these are folks on St. Paul Island. These are the pelts of small fur seals. All this is salt, so they're rubbing salt into the pelts to preserve them. So this was done up until 1984. If you're interested at all in the history, or if you're going to go up there, I recommend two books that you read. This is called Wisdom Keeper. All the native folks up on the Pribilofs, they all have Russian names. And so this is Ilarion Markuliev, who's from the Pribilof Islands, excuse me. And he is now a global leader for indigenous rights. So he travels all around the world, sticking up for Native people all over the world. So he's from St. Paul. This is a very interesting perspective from him. And this is by Sumner McLeish, who just died last summer of COVID. And she was a young reporter from NPR, and she was sent by NPR up to do stories on this controversial harvest when the protests were going on. So she spent quite a while up there, and they fell in love and got married and had some kids. So, but they're very, very different books. This is clearly a book from a white perspective of somebody going to this island and trying to fit in. And this is a native perspective. So side by side, I found them fascinating books. Anyway, just put a plug if you want to learn more about this fascinating place. This is a good place to start. This is a picture of part of the town of St. Paul, and right in the center is the Russian Orthodox Church. So everybody has a Russian name, and they all go to the Russian Orthodox Church. And here, right behind the town, this is one of the main fur seal breeding beaches right here. This was home sweet home for us. This is a NOAA Research Center, so the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration Research Center. There was nobody there when we were there, and so NOAA they gave us 2 luxury apartments for free for 2 months, and we were looking out over this tidal estuary, and we were right in town. This is the old folks' home, the Senior Citizen Center, that I'll come back to later, because you've heard of citizen science. Well, this is senior citizen science right here. It turned out really cool. So anyway, here was home. Here's a more typical view. It's very foggy a lot of the time and windy. I just checked. The winds up there this whole next week are going to be 40 miles an hour or higher. And the name of Sumner's book is 7 Words for Wind. So they have a lot of different words for different kinds of wind. But this is a typical view from the NOAA Research Station. And even in June, I was wearing long underwear, pants, overpants, like 4 layers, and gloves and hats. And we would look out, and there'd be kids out swimming. And we're like, oh, we got to toughen up here. Here's a view. So the town has really diversified. The people have figured out a lot of other ways to make a living. These are halibut boats. So it's one of the best halibut fisheries in the world. It's got the lowest mercury of any halibut measured in the world, so it's really good. There's the NOAA Research Station where we lived. You can see the beach right in front. It was a really popular place for people to hang out. And one of the most amazing things for us is I didn't know, it was just 2 white guys out there for the summer, and I didn't know how we would be viewed. But they've got a really great tribal ecology and conservation department. And they really care about their environment, both on the land and the marine environment. And before we got there, about a month before we got there, the head of the tribal Department of Ecology and Conservation made a sort of wanted poster. So it had pictures of the 2 of us with little bios, and like, you're gonna see these white dudes, and here's what they're gonna be doing, studying the Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches. And be nice to them. And so it was amazing. Before we got there, like, everybody knew we were coming, and there wasn't a single time that somebody was passing us that they wouldn't wave or stop or say, hey, that guy over there, he really likes the finches and have a feeder, go check him out. And so, and the other neat thing was when the halibuts just started, we put out, we asked one of our friends, hey, if anybody has a little extra halibut, we'd love to buy some. And the word went out in the community, and within 15 minutes, we got a call saying, from a woman saying, my son just caught the first halibut of the season, and our family would be honored to share it with you. And so we went over, and there was this huge halibut, and their son Henry, who was 16 years old, going out fishing on the open Bering Sea, they gave us this insane amount of halibut. And I asked him, I said, you know, help me out with the etiquette here. You said this would be a gift, but we'd love to pay for it, but we don't want to insult you. And, you know, and she laughed, said, thanks for asking, but no, this is a gift. And then we got talking to the 16-year-old kid, Henry, and he'd just been accepted to Yale. And so we were talking to him, and he was going away, and he was very excited. So I said, how about this? How about I make a donation, but it's not for the halibut, it's for the Henry Goes to Yale Fund. And they're going, that's a great idea. So I was there like peeling off the dough, and it's like, that's for Henry, not the fish. But then all summer long, we kept getting phone calls like, hey, come on up to my house. And like, it's the purple one, past the red one on the hill. And so these folks just came in with a whole truckload of small halibut. He said, we know where to catch the big ones, but they don't taste very good. And they would just fill up garbage bags that we could barely carry. They were so heavy. So we were halibut-based life forms when we were there. So anyway, it was a very special experience for me, you know, getting to see this community and how they've persevered in the face of lots of hardships. The picture I showed you of the tundra, it looked pretty gray. That was just after we got there. But during the summer, the tundra is beautiful. It comes to life. Here's the only tree up there, Arctic willow, and it's about an inch tall. So those are the catkins. That's the tallest part. But lots of lupins. This is a different species than the one we get here, Arctic poppies, and so forth. So the tundra is absolutely spectacular in the summer. All right. Here is a picture of what things looked like about 12,000 years ago. And so this is the Bering land bridge. And so here's the Aleutians. And so you can see this is where people came across to North America from Siberia. And lots of animals came across here. So this was a major migration route back and forth for wildlife and people. So it's all. Yeah, so this is the Cordilleran ice sheet, and this is what blocked up to make glacial Lake Missoula down here. And this is the main Laurentian ice sheet and so forth. There actually, it doesn't show this, but there were actually kind of ways to get down. And certainly after things started melting about 10,000 years ago, there were ways to, you know, connect. But here's where the Pribilofs were 12,000 years ago. They were part of the mainland of this Bering land bridge. So Diane said she went up to study Arctic foxes and on St. Paul, yeah. And so on the Aleutian Islands, so Arctic foxes have been introduced on lots of islands all over the place for their pelts, but they wreak havoc on seabird colonies and other things. So where they've been introduced, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has aggressive policies of getting rid of them, hunting them out, because they were only recently introduced. But there's tons of Arctic foxes on St. Paul Island, and they don't hunt them at all. And I asked why, and they said, well, they got here on their own, and they've been there for 12,000 years. Okay, so there's no the policy is they got here on their own, just leave them. So you can see this is where the Pribilofs are now, isolated out in the ocean. This is the continental shelf. And so the Pribilofs, you can see, are right on the edge of this very shallow seabed, and that's why it was land. But they're right on the edge of this very, very deep water. So the continental shelf drops off right south of the Pribilofs. Yes, Joe?
We commonly accept the migration from Russia or Siberia over to North America. Is there a migration the other way?
This way.
Yeah.
Yes. So the reason that a lot of birders go out here is because if you're working on your North American life list, there's birds that get blown over to some of these islands that are seen nowhere else in North America. So when we were there, we had a few strong storms coming from the west, and weirdo birds from Asia and Siberia turn up then. But Joe, yeah, similarly, when there's really strong storms going this way, there's birds that get blown over that way as well. So there was the Bering Land Bridge. And so this is why you get Arctic foxes all over the Pribilofs. This was a male that hung out right in front of our house. He was very tame. And he was always there right above the beach, and we didn't quite know why. But this was his response to us. And the reason he was hanging out there standing guard was because there was a little cave right at high tide level, and they had 12 pups. And so at low tide, they would come out and roughhouse on the beach. So that was pretty neat. There's caribou on the island, and they're really, really big caribou. And you can find antlers like this all over the island. They're really big. And they've got an interesting history on the island too. And so the folks on St. Paul, they hunt the caribou quite a bit because there's no wolves, there's no other predators. And if they leave them alone, their numbers go through the roof, and they just mow down the vegetation on the island. And so they've got a very careful management plan to keep the numbers at a good level so they don't trash the vegetation. And another thing that I learned was this was the last place on Earth that woolly mammoths existed. As recently as about 4,500 years ago, there were woolly mammoths out here. And they got there, of course, because the Pribilofs were part of the mainland, and they were just there. And then when the sea level rose, they were stuck on this island. And there are still find things like this. What's really interesting is there's lava caves and lava tubes that run underneath the island. And you can look down in some of these and see great big huge bones and fur from the mammoths. It's still down there, and people have gone and they've collected the bones and the hair, and they've extracted DNA. They've sequenced woolly mammoth DNA from these fairly recent finds. But what's really neat is the people on the Pribilofs, they have the story about this sort of big hairy Bigfoot dude, and there's his name in their language, and they say he runs around under the island in these lava tubes and caves. And so if their kids are misbehaving, they're like, hey, smarten up, or big hairy Sasquatch dude is going to come grab you. So this might be from seeing those big bones and fur down in the caves. And most of you may have heard of this goofy movie with Steve Martin about the big year, and there's a scene in there where they do go out to the Pribilofs for ticking birds. And the reason is because when there are strong winds coming from the west or the north, this is what blows a lot of weirdo birds down onto the Pribilofs. So an island of this size, 12 miles by 5 miles, should not have over 300 species of birds on it, especially in the polar regions, where you tend to have low species diversity. But this is a reason that a lot of people are interested in going out to places like this. So it's now up to 317 species of birds that have been recorded on the Pribilofs. And we weren't there for hardcore ticking, but there was a couple strong systems that came through. And so there were interesting birds. This is a common cuckoo from Asia that came over that put on quite a show and was really hungry and really tame. And there was a bunch of other species that were blown over. One of the businesses that the tribes do that brings in a fair amount of money to their local economy is ecotourism, and especially bird tourism. So you can fly out to the Pribilofs, stay in a hotel, and they have really, really good guides that'll take you around and show you all this stuff. So there was tours going on when we were there. But what I'm going to focus on mainly is some of the more common birds, just because they're incredibly cool in their own right. And then I'll get to the Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches. So this is one of my favorite sandpipers up there. They were very common rock sandpipers. Here's one eating periwinkles off the rocks in the intertidal. And whenever you get close to their nests or babies, they show you their armpits and run around and do broken wing displays like killdeers, but they're just beautiful. And there's a couple little babies. Here's one, the day it hatched. So when they hatch, their legs are almost adult size, and then you got a little tiny cotton ball with a beak on it. And over the next few weeks, their body grows to catch up with their legs. But they'll run and then just crouch down, and they're absolutely invisible. They look just like the tundra. This is on one of the few really nice, sunny, warmish days. So there are millions of seabirds that nest around the islands on St. Paul and St. George. Very, very rich seabird community, about 16 different species. And I'll show you just a few of them. So here's my buddy Bruce, and we're enjoying the seabirds here. Now, let's see, I think I have to click on it. Here's just a little video to give you a sense of what. So that sort of maniacal laugh, those are thick-billed or common murres, both are there, and kittiwakes. There's couple flavors of kittiwakes. So there's the black-legged kittiwake, which is widely, I gotta add, so yeah. Here we go. Black legs, dark eye. If you see one of these here, call Dan right away. Yeah. But there's also a local specialty, the red-legged kittiwake. So these are sort of a Pribilof Aleutian Islands specialty. They've got a very restricted range. And they actually do have a darker mantle, but they're really neat gulls. I showed you a still photo of in the Galapagos, the birds raining out of the sky. And here's a video I took of kittiwakes raining out of the sky after fish. Similar sort of deal. Here's a larger gull. There's a murre. Yeah. Here's a murre. Those are murres. There was a puffin in there somewhere. So we saw this all the time, and this just gives you an idea of how rich the local marine environment is. There's lots of alcids, the auks. These are the northern hemisphere equivalent of penguins, right? They make their living by diving, swimming underwater, just like penguins. But unlike penguins, they can fly, but most of them are just barely on the edge of flight and non-flight. So there was a lot of horned puffins. And here's some horned puffin courtship. So a male's handing a female a twig, and they nest back in little caves. There was a lot of tufted puffins, which I hadn't seen a lot before, but they're just absolutely stunning. And here's some courtship behavior, sort of mutual preening. So when we see pictures of puffins, you know, they're often lovey-dovey and, oh, they're so cute and beautiful. But these bills, they're amazing foraging tools, right? They catch fish with them. And they're brightly colored, so they're clearly used in courtship and pairing up and stuff. But it also turns out that they can be wicked weapons. So here was a pair of tufted puffins, and we were sure this was going to be a death match. This went on for more than half an hour until one broke off, and the winner kept after it for about a half an hour. And we thought they were going to catch, and it only ended when the loser threw himself onto the rocks. So that fight went on for almost 45 minutes, and they were holding each other underwater, and it was really, really wicked. So it was a new side of puffins that, yeah, so that I'd never seen before. Here's some thick-billed murres, and there was common murres. So these are also really neat alcids. Here's some of my favorites. Parakeet auklets were very common. And what do you notice about these guys' eyeballs? They're white. And how about their iris? Tiny, tiny little pinhole eyeball, right? You can't notice it, you know, with the alcids that have dark eyes. You can't see how big their iris is. But the alcids that have lighter colored irises, they have very, very small pinhole iris pupils. And here's a crested auklet, similarly kind of a very small pupil. All right, so these were really cool. They were courting. So these are the northern hemisphere equivalents of penguins. There was one auk that did achieve full penguinhood. So the great auk was flightless. Unfortunately, were killed off by people. I would have loved to have seen those. I've been on an island, Great Island off Newfoundland, where they used to nest. And I've seen puffins digging down in the turf to make their own burrows and coming up with great auk skulls in their beaks and throwing them out. So, but I said these auks are on the edge of flight and no flight. Here's a crested auklet trying to land on a cliff, and they come and they're like Mach 2 and they hit the cliffs, and usually they just slide down the cliffs and fall and take off, and it usually takes them about 10 or 20 times to actually land. Here's some least auklets, and again, you can see they have tiny little pinhole pupils. And I think the reason for this might be, this is just a hypothesis at this point, but most of these auklets dive for their food unbelievable depths in the ocean, like way, way, way down where there's barely any light reaching. You know, and so I think their retinas, their eyeballs must be built for they're very sensitive to very, very, very low light conditions, because they're catching like bioluminescent squid and other fish that bioluminescent way down in the ocean. And so I think when they're up in bright sunny conditions, I think this very small pupil is it's their sunglasses to protect their very sensitive eyeballs. I don't know that anybody's looked at the sort of eyeball physiology of these things, but I suspect that's the reason. And if you look at what native folks do in the area, you can get sun blindness if you spend a lot of time, right? And it's bright and snowy and sunny. If you don't protect your eyes, you will get snow blindness. And so here's a pair of traditional goggles that they use. And this is modern day, because you can see the car in the background. This is caribou bone, but similar sort of idea of just making a very, very small slit to protect their eyes. So that's my idea, and I'm sticking with it. Here's a red-faced cormorant. It's a really nice bird up there. Northern fulmars, they come in several different flavors. Here's a vanilla one. Here's a more chocolate one. So these are in the albatross family. They're very interesting. They forage way, way, way out at sea. And once they have babies, they will leave their chick for like 2 weeks at a time and go out hundreds of miles foraging and then come back and feed their babies. So very different sort of life history than these auks that have their babies, and the babies leave when they're about 14 days old. They just bail and jump off the cliffs. So some really interesting seabirds. Here's one of the more common birds, songbirds on the island, chestnut-collared longspur. Oh, I should say, when I got out there, I was struck by so many things, but it struck me as being really kind of weird in some ways. And it took me a few days to realize, like, so when you're walking around the fields down near Nine Pipes or something, in a good winter, like all those raptors are there because there's all those voles running around, right? There's no small mammals on the Pribilofs. I don't know why, even though it was connected not too long ago. There's no voles, there's no ground squirrels, there's no lemmings. And the other thing is there's no corvids. So there's no crows or ravens or magpies. There's no corvids, which are fairly ubiquitous. It's about everywhere you go. And there's no raptors, except the weirdos that get blown over, okay? And they usually don't last very long. So it's very interesting ecologically in some major components that we're just take for granted around here, raptors and corvids and small mammals, entirely missing from the island. So these were really neat. And house sparrows and little baby house sparrow, I'm sorry, house wren. All right, so this is just a warm up to give you a sense of sort of the magic of the islands and what a special place it is. And now I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about the real reason we went up, which was this preliminary study to see if we could, would be a good place to look at gray-crowned Rosy-Finches. So here they are. This isn't a small mammal like from the Pribilofs. Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches are often described as the pikas of the bird world, because these guys live in rock and talus slopes at high elevation generally, right, where it's very cold. And there's a lot of concern about them getting squeezed off mountaintops as things warm up, right? And so in many respects, the gray-crowned Rosy-Finches are sort of viewed as a bird equivalent, a barometer perhaps of climate change. The Arctic is warming up faster than any other place on Earth, and so the Pribilofs are way up there, and they are warming up. Here's about the only data slide I'm going to show you. And Bo mentioned there was a bunch of different species of Rosy-Finches. And take a look at this map. There's this one species that's over in Asia, the Asian Rosy-Finch. These are the Aleutian. These are gray-crowned Rosy-Finches, but in the Aleutians, these are the Rosy-Finches on the Pribilofs. They're a different color for a reason I'll tell you in a minute. And here's North American populations. So they live in the mountains all the way up in Brooks Range and all the way down. Here's an inset. They go down the central mountains, the Cascades and the Sierras, way down in California. They're down in New Mexico and Utah and so forth. This is what's called a molecular phylogeny of the Rosy-Finches. And I'm not going to spend time taking you through it, except to point out that this red, which are the Pribilof, so these are based on genetic data. The red of the Pribilof Islands, they're very, very different than the blue Aleutian ones, but they're most closely related, which is no big surprise, right? These guys probably got there from the Aleutians. But the Gray-crowned Rosy-Finches in the Pribilofs are genetically very distinct from any other Rosy-Finches. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The Asian ones are they're way out there. So they're very, very distinct. And then when you get into the continental US mountains, it's a complete mishmash, as you might expect. There's lots of birds moving around and lots of interbreeding and so forth. The purple ones down here, these are the ones in these isolated mountain ranges down in New Mexico. So they're distinct as well. Anyway, the point is that interesting group of birds with an interesting history that is reflected in their geography. But these guys are pretty distinct in some ways. They are huge. Here's what a gray-crowned Rosy-Finch from around in California or around here looks like. They're about, say, 30 grams or so. We were catching female Rosy-Finches in the Pribilofs that were coming in at like 65 grams. So more than twice the mass. These were like almost like small starlings, some of these. They're humongous. They don't migrate. So they're there all winter long. They don't go anywhere. Now, Bo mentioned that it's really hard to study the breeding biology of gray-crowned Rosy-Finches in most places where they exist. And this is why. This is a typical nest of a gray-crowned Rosy-Finch. So good luck getting up there. And here is a picture of a colleague who studies gray-crowned Rosy-Finches down in Wyoming. And this is the field gear they have to use to study gray-crowned Rosy-Finches in most places. It's climbing gear, right? You got to be an expert climber. And here he is looking for a nest in a vertical cliff face at about 11,000 feet above a snowfield. Okay, so there's virtually nothing known or very, very little known about the breeding biology of gray-crowned Rosy-Finches in most places in the continental US. Okay, but when they do come down to lower elevations during the winter, you can get information on them, which is what Bo and Audubon and are doing, which is fantastic. This is prime breeding habitat for gray-crowned Rosy-Finches in the Pribilofs. Okay, this is a junkyard right outside of the airport. And in this old beat up tractor, there was about 6 gray-crowned Rosy-Finch nests. Here's an old car junkyard, an old beat up car. This window was bashed out. I looked in the window. There on the seat is a gray-crowned Rosy-Finch nest. So they nest in people's gutters. If there's a car that hasn't been used in a while in somebody's yard, they're underneath their bumpers. And so we found more gray-crowned Rosy-Finch nests than probably all other researchers in the world put together in our short time there. So it turns out it's relatively easy to find and study gray-crowned Rosy-Finches. They also take to nest boxes. So we built a whole bunch of nest boxes. These are the traps we caught them in, called potter traps. I'll show you a little bit more about those. But we went around town and put up a whole bunch of nest boxes. Here's the mayor of St. Paul. This is Yakov Markuliev. And he chased us down, and he loves gray-crowned Rosy-Finches. And he chased us down. He said, I hear you built some nest boxes. We're like, yeah. He said, I would love one on my house. So we went, this is a picture just after I went up and put a box up on the mayor's house. So he was really happy about that. Oh, and the folks know so much about these birds. He was like, you know, you could tell me exactly what they eat during the different times of year. He said, you know, they breed twice a year. It's not in the literature, but good to know. So we got so much good information from the local folks. In the winter, it's brutal there. In most places, say in Alaska, like about the only bird you see in the middle of winter is a raven, right? They don't even have ravens there, but they do have gray-crowned Rosy-Finches, and they flock into town. So this is their bird. All the seabirds have taken off. So it's about the only bird they see all winter long, and they love them. we did find a lot of nests in these junkyards and in town and stuff, but they still do love to nest on cliffs in cracks. This is an old abandoned quarry just outside of town, within walking distance of town, and you can see these old basalt cliffs. And they do love to nest in here. So there was about 150 birds nesting right here. And here's me, I found the first nest of the season right up. There was actually 3 nests here, one there, and one in here. So you can see they nest very, very close to each other. So even though they're on cliffs here, we didn't need climbing gear. They're very handsome birds. We call them puffballs. They've got these very showy feathers, the males especially, and they do a lot of displaying during the breeding season. And here is one of the easiest ways to find the nests. This is caribou hair, and this is a little video. This is a female. This is one of the best things to line your nest with, super warm, insulating stuff. So this was like crack cocaine for the finches. We would put out little bits of caribou fur, and they would boom, flock to it, and then fly right to their nests. Those are gray-crowned Rosy-Finches singing in the background. The melodious, just like house sparrows. Okay, the feather, you folks all know this, feathers are super important up there. They've got really, really thick feathers, important for insulation, important for flight, but especially during the breeding season, there are these bright little peacocks. They spend an inordinate amount of time taking care of their feathers. They only molt, they molt twice a year, some of the feathers, but they really have to take care of their feathers. So here's what they spend a lot of time doing. You can see how thick those feathers are. And then they spend hours preening. So they really, really take care of the feathers. And you can see those bright red dots on the breast feathers. And so those are used a lot in display. That's zipping the barbs together on the wings. We didn't know how easy it would be to catch them. We usually, around here, I usually use mist nets to catch birds, but it's so windy up there that it's just impossible. You can't use mist nets. So these are called potter traps. They're like have-a-heart traps. There's a little treadle here, and if they go in for those seeds and they step on that, it drops this little door. It turns out when we put seeds on the ground, we would have hundreds of birds there. And we would come up, once they got used to it, when we would drive up, they would come up to our car and like, hey, come on, we're out of seeds here, like, come on. And so I think I have the world's record for the fastest capture of a rosy finch. It was under 1 second. So I went and opened the door, and I was on my knees, and I put the seeds in there, and then I was standing up, and kaboom, one was in before I even turned around. So here's our mobile banding lab. You can see this is a more typical day, foggy and cold and windy, and so we would orient it to help shelter from the wind a bit. And we could only keep these traps open for about 5 minutes before we would catch birds that would take us hours to process. So this is a clothesline. Each of those bags has a bird in it. And so we did lots of standard measurements. And here's weighing a rosy finch in a red hook storm surge hazy IPA. And Bruce thought this, he came up with this, he thought this was a great way to measure rosy finches. And this is blowing on the breast feathers of a bird. And so there's a lot of, sometimes it's hard to tell the females from the males. Sometimes it's not, but they're like a dull male or a bright female. They can be kind of hard. But when you blow on them and you see this, you know it's a female. This is the brood patch. And so look how highly vascularized this is. You can see all these veins right on the surface of the skin. Birds, their furnaces run really hot. Their temperature is about 104, 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which would put us in the hospital, right? But this is their normal thermostat. So the females have these, and she sits on the eggs right here. So when we saw that, we knew we had a female. They happily gave us blood samples for genetic work. And we gave them their own personalized bling. So we color banded them. This is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band with a number on it, a light aluminum band. And then we gave them unique color combinations that they'll keep for the rest of their lives. So it will allow us to follow them throughout the course of their lives, and allow the people in St. Paul to keep track of them when they're at their feeders and so forth. And so here is green over orange, light blue over metal, just before we release it. And so you can see they don't bother the birds. They seem just fine with them. The males especially are very aggressive during the breeding season with each other, even though they can nest very close to each other. There's a lot of squabbling. And so here's two color birds. What this also allowed us to do, not only could we tell who was paired with which bird and where their nests were, but we could see how they were interacting with each other. And so we could construct dominance hierarchies. So we know this bird is dominant over this bird because it's taking off. And so this is part of ongoing long-term behavioral studies on sexual selection. And we hope to figure out why they're so darn big up there as well. This is sort of a Keystone's Cops movie. There's a little seed pile here. This is speeded up, but just to give you a sense of how much squabbling they do. So you can see they spend almost more time chasing each other than they do feeding. And here's slowed down. Okay, so a lot of interesting behavioral interactions, even though they're highly social, with about 150 nests on those cliffs right there, and yet so they nest close to each other, they forage in flocks, and yet there's these very interesting dominance relationships. So here's the first babies of the season that we banded, so we were really happy about that. Yeah, so this is when they're about 7 days old. They fledge about 14, so this is just about a week later, so they grow incredibly quickly. So this is a fledgling about 14, 15 days old. We didn't band this one, we didn't find that one's nest. But, one of the really interesting things was, I mentioned the senior center. And so there was a woman named Marta, and she loves the finches, and she throws seed out in front of her house. And she got in touch with us, and she said, "There's a banded bird, a finch, out at my feeder." And we said, "Oh, great." She said, "I'm taking a picture of it with my iPhone and sending it to you right now." And so we got more interesting observations from the seniors living in the senior center. And it was amazing, because what we found out, thanks to them, was only males were coming from that rock quarry about 5 miles out of town. They were flying all the way into town and feeding, and then going all the way back. And yeah, so there's just all sorts of very interesting stuff that we know nothing about, but the folks up on St. Paul now are keeping track of whenever they see banded birds and who they're with and all that kind of stuff. So that is the end of my talk, I believe, yes. So thank you very much, and be happy if you have any questions at all.
What's the future of the study?
The question was, what's the future of the study? We plan on going back. So I hope to spend another couple months up there this summer with my colleagues, and we'd like to keep it going and turn it into sort of a Darwin's Finch of the North study. It really does look like this is one of the better places in the world, certainly in terms of logistics to, even though it's very hard to get there, once you're there, it's a really, really nice place to study these birds. We're interested in studying sort of the behavioral ecology of these birds, as well as, right now we can't really say anything about climate change, but this will maybe be baseline that in 10, 20, 30 years, people can compare it to. Yes?
I was wondering, you said the water was fairly shallow around the islands on that continent, but what's shallow?
I'm not, so the question was, for those of you in the zoomosphere, how deep was that water off the continental shelf? I'm not sure. I should know that, but however much the ocean rose since after the last ice age, but it's probably maybe hundreds of feet, something like that, rather than, once you go off the continental shelf, you get into thousands of feet. Diane?
So you weren't there very long, but do you have any information on the main cause of mortality for the silverites?
So Diane's question is, any information on the main cause of mortality for these guys? We saw very little during the summer. It's probably the good time of year for them. We suspect that most of them, especially the young ones, die over the winter. It was an interesting skewed age distribution with a lot of older birds and not many birds that were born the previous year. So we can tell if we catch a bird by looking at some of their feather tracks, if they were born the previous year. And we saw very few of those. So we suspect, it's a very harsh place during the winter with 70-mile-an-hour winds for a lot of the time and sub-zero freezing temperatures. So we don't know. I was trying to convince my buddies to go up in the middle of winter, but I didn't get much of a enthusiasm about that. Dan?
Do you attempt to get a population estimate?
We've got a raffle going with the locals. Yeah, so we've got some prizes for, and we don't, but there were a couple real hot spots. That quarry, a lot around the town, but then once you get outside, it was very different. So as you walk along the cliffs, the seabird cliffs, you would see a pair maybe every quarter to a half mile. So very low density. And if you go into the interior, you see them flying into the interior, but we found very few nests there. So we're kind of thinking on the 1,000, like maybe 2,000, 3,000, fairly small populations. Another thing I didn't tell you, but they're interesting, they have crops. And they're built for flying long distance. We'd see them fly long distances and come back with their throat pouches full of seeds. And then later in the summer, once we weren't there for that, but later in the summer when all the fur seals are breeding and it warms up, apparently you go down near the ocean and like every rock is solid flies. And it's kind of cold, so they don't move very fast. So the locals say they just go down and pig out till they can't eat another fly. Yeah. But we suspect maybe certainly under 5,000 birds. And I would think more like 2,000, which is not very big population size. So we're taking a lot of blood samples, and we'll be able to do a lot of genetic work, estimating how big the population is, and we suspect there might be fairly high levels of inbreeding, which we'll be able to detect just because, so they probably listen to country music up there. Sorry if you like country music. It's a joke. Hey, I listen to country music driving up. It's about all I could get in the radio.
So the Aleutian birds are migratory. Are they partially migratory?
Partially migratory, but in some of the islands they stick around. Yeah. But yeah. So.
Can I tell her another story about the caribou up there? There's another island a little further north called St. Matthews, and a very small island. And apparently during World War II, they put some Navy guys up there, you know, because they were concerned about the Japanese, and they said, we don't know when we're going to be able to get back here. So they apparently left them 10 caribou. And they said, you know, you got to be really careful because we don't know when we're coming back. Well, at the end of the war, when they went back, and there was, you know, 10 caribou, and so they pulled the Navy guys off, and there's nobody to them. And then they went back about 20 years later, and, you know, 3,000 caribou. And then they went back, I guess it was early in 1990, because we were up there in 92, and they came back and they were 8 caribou. And so they shot one, turns out they shot the only male. But it was clearly they had eaten themselves out of house.
Yeah. Let me ask one question of Diane. So what were you looking at with the foxes up
So
there?
my friend Paula White, she's got her PhD, but she was looking at the Arctic fox for her master's, and she was looking to see if they absolutely were native fox, because they were going to protect them. This was back 25 years ago. So I remember going in to help her trap fox. Now I spent my career trapping wolves, and so she'd pull up in the truck and she'd put a fox trap out near like the fisheries dock, and then we'd go sit in the truck and have tea, and the fox would walk in and get caught. We'd go out and we would dang it. It's like, no! She was looking at the native and what they were consuming and how many there were on the island and where they done, and they were all protected, but there were a few guys who were still chopping them just for fur. I don't know if it's subsistence or what, but
Yeah.
that's what.
The other interesting thing about, you know, if you go to any other native settlements in Alaska, like there's dogs everywhere, right?
Yeah.
There's no dogs on the island, and they're not allowed on St. Paul. They're not allowed on the Pribilofs because they're worried about diseases they might bring in for the foxes and spread to other marine mammals. So interesting, no corvids, no small mammals, no dogs, no raptors.
No rats either?
No rats, no rats.
No
Yeah.
cats.
There are cats.
Oh.
There are cats, and they're major prey. That's probably another major source of mortality for the finches.
Yeah.
Is the cats. Yeah, they said there are cats like to eat those finches. Yeah. Well, thanks, folks.
Oh.